Welcome to All Home Care Matters, the show where we discuss all things home care, with discussions on important age-related matters and topics. Brought to you by Enriched Life Home Care Services, the #1 rated home care provider in Michigan by Top Rated Local.
Hello, and welcome back to All Home Care Matters. If this is your first time visiting us here at the show, we want to say thank you for taking time out to be with us today. We appreciate how valuable everyone's time is, and that's why we try and make each episode here at All Home Care Matters something that will hopefully matter to you. Today, I am honored to welcome a remarkable guest and good friend, the founder of Carefullist, Katie Kristofic. Welcome, Katie. How are you?
Thanks for having me. It's nice to see you. I'm doing well, thanks.
Thank you. And hopefully I pronounced your last name right. Kristofic. Yeah. Okay. So let's go back. All right. So for those who perhaps missed your last time joining us, you were really in the early stages of the Carefullist, and it wasn't even officially rolled out yet. Maybe it's been about a year ago, roughly, right around there. It's been quite a while.
June.
Okay. Wow, that's it. I was thinking so about about 5 months.
The website June.
Okay.
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit about yourself as a caregiver and the company, the Carefullist. Bring us up to speed on who you are and what the Carefullist is.
Sure. So thanks again for having me. It's always nice to talk with you. The Carefullist is an online resource. So it's a website and a series of social channels to support caregivers. It brings together lots of different services that are out there, tools and products and all kinds of things for people who are taking care of loved ones at home. So the way I came up with this is because my family went through an Alzheimer's journey, and it lasted for about 12 years that we all took care of my mom, my dad primarily, and my sister, and then I was a couple of hours away. And so to figure out how I could help, even though I wasn't close by, I did a lot of research and networking and pulling information together because I could do that remotely. And what I found was that it was more time consuming than I ever anticipated. And it was harder to know what was good, what was not, and sort of sorting through and weeding through all that was out there. There's lots. Some of it's good, some of it not so much. So the Carefullist's goal is to sort of sift through all of that and become a one-stop resource for people who are caring for loved ones at home.
Yeah. And it's really needed. Like you said, there's not a lack of information, but there's a lack of good information. There's promises for cures and, things that just, when you're already going through a difficult time caring for a loved one, and most people are not familiar with the healthcare system, with the long-term care. I call it the long-term care matrix. Yeah. It's very easy to become prone to or susceptible to these false promises and, really empty treatments that you're going to either invest your time on, your money on, and then you're going to have no results. And when the bottom line is you're just trying to best care for a loved one and ultimately also care for yourself, because being a family caregiver is an emotionally, physically draining experience. And it's also sometimes a financially draining experience if you have to miss work, take time off, or maybe mom or dad or whoever the loved one is on a very small fixed income and, they need depends or they need, an insurer for their nutrition or whatever it is. Insurance doesn't pay and cover everything. There's a lot of things that families need that insurance isn't going to cover. And so every dollar and every minute matters. So when we had last spoke, though, we just decided you just launched your website. How did that process go for you? Because, you took this experience caring for your mother, and in my mind, I always envision people that get into this kind of like me with my father. We were looking for solutions for our situation and we didn't receive any. And a lot of times healthcare professionals stay in their own silos and they don't really go outside of that.
Yes.
but people take those experiences, and the ones that stay in it, they're staying in it because they're trying to help support that person that they were previously to get to the resources and have the support that they need. And then there's others that are doing it because they want to keep the memory of their loved one alive. Which bucket do you fall in? Or maybe it's a little bit of both.
I have a foot in each bucket.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, yeah, the Carefullist really is a love letter to my mom. She was very much someone who cared for other people, um, and wanted the best for other people. And her life was one that was, servitude isn't necessarily the best word, I would say, but she lived in service of others. And so Carefullist certainly honors that aspect of her personality. We've woven things into our branding, and throughout the site, she really loved flowers and nature, and she was very artistic. So I take little aspects of her personality and I weave them into what we do. But the overall goal of Carefullist really centers around who she was as a person. Um, and it's been a very cathartic way for me to channel my grief in losing her, and still feeling close to her and doing something that would honor her and does honor her.
Yeah, that's beautiful. I would even mention too, you were saying weaving it in, her memory, the logo, right? Isn't that based off of
Yeah.
her favorite colors and flower?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yep. She really had a knack for flower arrangements, and she was good gardener. So the logo, I chose vines because when she would do floral arrangements, she would put baby's breath and other types of filler things in, but she would really strategically place them. So the logo actually makes a V, and her name was Victoria. She went by Vicky. And from a business perspective, it represents the funneling of information. So you start with all this information, and what Carefullist is doing is distilling it down and making it easier for people to find what they're looking for.
Oh, it's wonderful and so greatly needed. So the website is about 6 months old.
Yeah.
What would you say that you've learned from that and some of the feedback you've received?
Yeah, thanks. That's a good question. I think the biggest thing I've learned is, because there's so much information out there and our goal is to make it easier to find, we needed to kind of tweak how we have information organized and displayed on the site. So we are currently reorganizing things, and it will be launched in another couple of weeks, where we are adding filters and people can search by keywords and things like that to find more specifically what they're looking for and what they need. Um, we've heard from folks out in caregiving land about types of things that they use that they find helpful. We've had some questions come in. I'm looking for this. Do you know of anything? Can you help me find this? And we welcome that and we encourage that, because that's how we go through part of our vetting process. If you bring it to our attention, we can review it and see if we think it would be something that makes sense for the greater audience to know about. So the next piece that's going on to the site with this new version or this new launch is the addition of quite a few new resources. So we've spent several months vetting things and talking with folks. And so we'll be adding new things as well.
That's wonderful. Talk about the vetting process. When you say, you spend time vetting and researching, let's say we bring you something and you got to research it and vet it. Like, walk us through what that process looks like. What does that encompass?
Sure. So the first thing that I do is I just do a simple internet search, find out where it is, what it is, learn as much about it as I can. Any feedback that I can see, any public reviews, anything like that. And then I start asking my personal network and reaching out to folks that I know who work in healthcare, to reach out to their own networks and see if they can find anybody who's actually used it. So typically I try to get to two at least. I prefer three or more different people who've actually used the tool or used the product and can give me a good feel for what they think of it and what their experience was. And if it comes to a good review and I feel good about it, then we'll put it on the site. I also, if it's possible, try to reach out to either the author of the document or the tool, the creator of the product, or the founder of the company, and talk with them and get a good feeling from them about what their mission is, what they expect it to do, and then kind of compare that to what I've seen it do and what I've heard from others, their experiences with it.
That's wonderful. Did you, during this process of launching the Carefullist and, putting this all together, what was one of the biggest challenges that you didn't plan for? Like we all, when I say challenge that you don't plan for, if we're launching a website, we know there's a challenge of, getting Google to see it, getting it out there, that's all part of the growth. But aside from that, what's a challenge that you really were caught by surprise on?
Oh, that's a really good question. I think there were a couple of challenges. Some were surprises, some weren't. The one that was not so much a surprise was knowing how big of an undertaking this is. And starting out as just myself and trying to be the one to do all of it and get all of the information. A pleasant surprise was the number of people who are willing to help and know that this is an important thing to do, and are donating their time and their expertise or just their opinion as someone who is a caregiver themselves and they've used this thing and they say, yes, this is really good. I would definitely suggest that you put this on your site. So that was a pleasant surprise. Challenges, finding the best way to organize all of the resources that is the most user-friendly for people. I'm still working on that and refining that because people learn in different ways and they absorb information differently. They look for it in different ways, and trying to make sure that they can find it easily and it tells them what they need to know quickly. Those are the two goals. And I suspect that we will always be iterating on that and improving it. But I've been a little surprised at how difficult it is to hone in on that quickly.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sure. So something I was looking forward to talking to you about is some exciting news. It's not out yet. I believe at the time of this recording, you're doing your very first interview. But you're in the early stages of launching a podcast. Tell us how that came about.
Well, for those of you who don't know, after my first podcast with Lance, we had a good conversation afterward, and he and I had talked about benefits of podcasting and how many people there are who have stories to tell and how important it is that folks have that opportunity. And a podcast had not necessarily been on my radar. Honestly, it had not been on my radar at all. But the more I thought about it, the more it made sense. And to go back to what I said a couple minutes ago, people do learn and process information differently. So for some folks, it's much more beneficial to hear a conversation because they are auditory learners. So they process that information, maybe stories or things like that stick with them. And really, there is this huge need from a caregiving perspective for community. It's extremely lonely. It's very isolating. And you're tired.
Right.
You miss having friends. I mean, you have your friends, but you miss having your friends, the ability to go and meet somebody for lunch or to have the energy for a half an hour phone call. Caregivers often just don't have that. Their whole world becomes taking care of the person they love. And there's nothing wrong with that. But it is lonely and isolating, and it's this cycle that just kind of perpetuates. One thing that I personally found, and the more I talk with folks, it resonates with them, is you may not have the energy to have a conversation with a friend, but you have the energy or you have the time to listen to a conversation while you're doing laundry or while you have a few minutes to just not have to do other things, whatever that may be, and listen to a podcast and sort of feel like you're part of that conversation and that you could be friends with these people because they understand where you are and what you're feeling and how things are going. So the real goal is to get at that loneliness and isolation and let people know that there are many other folks out there who are experiencing the same thing. And if that is accomplished, then I will count it a huge success.
No, that's great. That's wonderful insights too, Katie. So, what's the name of the podcast?
The podcast is called Carefullist, the podcast. And I know it sounds a little bit on the nose, but I am a big comedy fan. And so when I was looking for what I wanted to call the podcast, I needed it to be something that people would understand right away what it is. But also, Mel Brooks is one of the funniest people on the planet, as far as I'm concerned. And Spaceballs is one of my favorite movies. And there's this whole part where, it's Spaceballs the coaster, Spaceballs the lunchbox. And so it just kind of very easily came to me that Carefullist, the podcast, makes a lot of sense because
Total sense.
one of the primary ways my sister and I in particular dealt with my mom's journey was through keeping our sense of humor.
Mm-hmm.
And it became really, really important so that we could keep other things in focus that were serious and that needed to be in focus. But you have to find some sort of release. Some people, it's running or meditating or whatever. For me, it's comedy.
Okay. All right. Your sister going to come on and get interviewed by you?
I would love for her to.
Yeah.
We're still working on that.
So going back to the podcast, are you going to do YouTube and audio, or just like the traditional audio podcast only?
Yep, it's going to be YouTube and audio. So again, accessibility is one of the things that I think more people are starting to focus on, and I'm happy about that.
Yeah.
But as someone in the caregiving space, I feel a real responsibility to set that example, and make sure that I am getting the information that people want and need out to them in the way that they can best receive it.
Absolutely. So let's talk about topics. So, all home care matters. We generally cover anything related to long-term care issues. So that could be a family caregiver, that could be, a dementia influencer, it could be a website developer who was a family caregiver, anything that falls under that long-term care, which pretty much is endless. What we did with like the Caregiver's Journal is we're strictly only interviewing current or former family caregivers to tell their journey and just talk about their caregiving experience. Conscious Caregiving with L&L that I do with Lori LeBay, we really pick hard-hitting topics and really, for the most part, have panels of experts related to that topic. So like one of our recent episodes was on seniors and safe driving. We had an undersheriff on there. We had an emergency room doctor. So we're trying to give the view of that topic from all angles, from all sides. With the care advocates that I do with Dr. Ackerman, he and I are really doing advocation issues related to advocating, talking about resources, talking about finding resources. So like every show has its theme, right? And there's a lot of crossover, obviously. But what types of topics and guests can the audience expect on Carefullist, a podcast?
Sure.
Do you have like a genre you're kind of targeting, or a specific area?
My primary goal is to get caregivers on and telling their stories. So that would be like the first requirement is you had to have been or currently are a caregiver long term. And then the first group of folks that I have lined up as guests all have developed something, whether it's a service or a product, based on their caregiving experience. So they're going to tell their caregiving story, and they're going to get into how and why they're doing what they're doing now, and sharing what they've learned and helpful tips to the listeners. So for the people who are caregiving right now, what was your go-to recipe? Your go-to food, something that was easy to pull together, because that's, believe it or not, one of the questions I get a lot
Sure.
is, you know, generally speaking, as a mom, I get kind of tired of having to try to figure out what I'm making for dinner most nights of the week. When you have caregiving on top of that, you just don't have the brain space to be thinking of things like that. So, giving people ideas that they can do things quickly, or something you can throw in the crock pot or whatever. So that's going to be a recurring question. So if that's on your mind, our podcast might be good for you.
Wonderful.
And the other question that you can plan to hear regularly is around the concept of comedy, but that's what brings me joy.
Right.
So how do you keep the things in your life that bring you joy? What are they, as a caregiver, so that when you identify what that thing is, you don't lose sight of it, and you figure out a way to make sure that you experience joy in some way, every day. Because caregiving, obviously, and this is talked about a lot, it takes such a mental toll and a physical toll on the caregiver. Um, it really is key to find something that brings levity and joy. And it can get really hard to find that.
Oh,
The road can get very, very dark very quickly. So identifying that light wherever you can find it,
yeah.
um, is really important.
Do you want to share? You said you got a batch of interviews lined up. You want to share who the guests might be, or who the guests are?
Sure. So I can share topics. Um, and so some of them are around financial planning, and from a caregiving perspective. So how can you have a financial plan when you're paying so much out of pocket for someone's
Important.
care, or if you've had to leave your job, either because your caregiving demands are too great to keep a job, or if unfortunately you have an employer who is not flexible and you've lost your job. Because that's more common than people really think or talk about, unfortunately. And something that I would like to see change.
Well, and hopefully too, FMLA, the Family Medical Leave Act, if your employer qualifies under the guidelines for that, families, I'm always amazed that people aren't aware of that. That saves
Right.
and protects your job. You don't earn an income from it. Excuse me. You don't earn an income from it, but it does protect your job from being, dissolved or getting released from.
Right.
So
And I
hopefully,
think a lot of folks think that it only applies if you become a parent. They don't realize that it applies to caregiving across the board.
right, absolutely. No, that's an important topic. So, what about with our audience? Anybody listening or watching this now, or even years from now, if they have suggestions for you for topics or guests, how would you like for them to contact you for the Carefullist podcast?
Sure. Um, you can contact us through our website. There's a contact us form. There's also an email address right on the site that is contact@carefullist.com.
Wonderful, wonderful. So, let's talk about you. What is your personal hope? What's your ambition, or goal by doing Carefullist the podcast? And how is it, before you answer, and how is that different than what your goal or ambition is and hopes for Carefullist the website? Is there a difference? Do you have a hope for
Mm.
one and like maybe they're different?
Yeah. So I think initially, when I was looking at doing the website, I was thinking the website might be a place for community. Um, and in the last months since I've launched the site, it's become very clear to me that the purpose of the site is that it is a tool. It is where you go for resources. So the podcast is really to join in with our social channels to create that sense of community and to be a place where, kind of like the Cheers theme song, everybody knows your name kind of thing. You just need to be around other people who get it. So it's really that community piece is the goal of the podcast. And certainly, to also bring awareness to the listeners of new services that are being added to the site and to learn more about what they might find on the site. So if we're adding a new product or a new service, when we have that guest on the podcast, they can hear the founder or whoever talk about it and explain sort of the backstory as to how they came to create what they've created and why. Because that's really important to me, that, there's nothing wrong with making money. Everybody has to. But what I want personally is to know that the folks who are involved are coming from a place of sincerity and they genuinely want to help. And what I've been very happy so far with the caregiving community is 99.9% of the people you talk to are genuine and they're sincere and they want to help because they see how much of a need there is. And that I think it's sort of become obvious that we have to come together and do this because it's not being done.
Right. And I agree wholeheartedly with that, Katie. One of the sad things about everything in the senior care, caregiving, little niche that we're all in is there wouldn't be a need for us if people were doing their jobs the way they should be done. Meaning, right. 2.5 years, my father lived with my wife and I'm a male caregiver, which is, kind of the unicorn in caregiving. They're out there, but there's not many. So I was kind of laughing when you were saying, and what do you make for dinner? And I'm thinking, I make nothing. I find the phone book and I call and order takeout. But, all that time though, we were never handed, given, or provided any sort of resource. And not only, and forget about us, but like even for my father, right? Right. They could have given him information about here's some resources if you want to find, caregivers that come in or even for myself, and none of that was ever done in 2.5 years. And we're not talking about just, old age. We're talking about, 7 major surgeries and home health care, totally unrelated to home care, home health care coming in, sometimes 5 times a week for their 45-minute to 60-minute visit to, check his wound or to give him physical therapy. But they never would look past that. They were only looking at the end of their nose and not any further, saying, have you guys looked at, these resources are in the community, there's home care companies that could come in if you, I was in college at the time, so you can go to your lab at 3:30 and you don't have to be here to let us in, you could get a caregiver for that period of time. That was not, I don't resent it per se, but it just, I'm dumbfounded that here it is X amount of years later. And now I'm on the other side meeting with countless families and talking to countless people. And their experience is basically a carbon copy of what mine was all those years ago. It still hasn't changed. And it's like, right. What do we have to do so there's not a need for a Carefullist or an all home care matters? And these families are getting the information right there in the office or in the hospital room or, at the pharmacy so that they know, hey, there's help out there and you're not alone. It just, I don't understand the reasoning. I really don't. But here nor there, we're both here and we're both helping people get to these resources. Go ahead.
Sorry, you said something that I triggered a thought that I've been thinking about a lot. And it's seeing the people in our generation stepping up and doing something about it. And depending how old you are, my grandparents were part of the greatest generation. I think a lot of people have grandparents or parents perhaps who were in the greatest generation and talk a lot about them and what they did. And if you look at the generation of folks who are anywhere from, maybe their mid 30s to their mid 50s who are in this range now and coming up with products and coming up with services, I don't think it's a far stretch to say that this could be our generation's greatest
Contribution.
gift, contribution. Yeah. That we are not going to have people do this alone anymore.
Yeah.
And we are going to force solutions because it's necessary. And I don't want my kids to deal with what I dealt with. I don't want that for them, and my parents didn't want it for us. So people stepping up and saying, you know what, it's going to stop with me and we're going to fix this, is extremely encouraging to me. And it's really what sort of lights my fire and gets me going.
Yeah, no, that's wonderful. Just kind of staying on the podcast, because that's one of the biggest reasons, that I thought we want to get you back, because this is a big deal. Part of the purpose of the podcast sounds like it's an opportunity for people who have been there to share what they've learned and to give ideas to those who are going through it. Does that pretty much sum up the whole driving principle behind launching Carefullist, the podcast?
Yes, absolutely. There's a fair amount of healing that takes place when you tell your story.
Sure.
And I think that is underutilized and underappreciated because we as a society have pushed caregivers to the side for so long and sort of silenced them, that once they start talking about it and find someone that they know understands and isn't going to judge them, they just keep talking. And it's all this stuff that they've held inside for so long, that I would encourage anyone, whether you're a guest on our podcast or not, find someone, reach out to connect with other people that are caregivers, and tell your story. It will help solidify your experience. It validates your experience, and it does help edge out the loneliness a little bit.
Yeah. And, we facilitate multiple caregiver support groups here in Michigan where we're at. And one of the things we always tell people, like first time people, or, it's their 10th time, even if you're not comfortable yet or confident enough yet to share your story, because, some people don't want to share those private, intimate, situations. Sure. Sit there and listen to it though, because just by listening to what others are going through, I kind of, feel like it helps them to feel a little bit better about their situation.
Right.
I have young kids, and, maybe one of them doesn't want to share that, they got an A- on a test and they think everybody else got an A++. Just listen. And, you might hear somebody say, oh, that was the hardest test. I got a B+. Right there, you're going to just feel better about yourself.
Right.
I always say too, and it's easy to say, but I did live it and I went through it. We always think we're going through the worst possible experience that's even imaginable. But unfortunately, there's going to always be a situation that's worse than what you're going through, and everybody's journey is their journey. We shouldn't be comparing what they're going through with what we're going through. What we need to do is just look at it and say, we're going to do the best that we can. It can always be worse. That's a famous saying everybody always says with all kinds of situations, but just make the best with your situation that you can, because again, the caregiving journey, it's not endless. There is an end to the journey someday. And I tell people also, you don't want to have regrets, because, regrets are, my grandma used to say, regrets are the one thing you can't change in life. I regret we didn't do X, Y, and Z while mom was still here. Now mom's not here. You can't go back and undo that. You just, whatever you do, you're going to have to just live with, and hopefully you feel good about, doing what you did for your loved one, and one of the other things I like to say too is, family caregivers who, let's say you're a banker or you're a computer engineer or you're a mechanic or whatever you are, anything but a healthcare professional, you're not going to have all the answers,
No.
But I tell people, don't worry about having all the answers, because what if I'm doing terrible? I tell them, whatever you do for your loved one, you're doing it from love, and you're doing it from a position with what you have. You're doing the best with what you have. And just know you're doing the best you can. Don't compare yourself to other people. If you have questions, be that squeaky wheel. Jump on the Carefullist and look for information. Call up that doctor's office and say, hey, look, I do not understand how this medicine's supposed to be given at all. I need help.
Right.
Don't be afraid to speak up. I do believe doctors all, for the most part, are innately and naturally good-spirited people, and they want to help. Hopefully that's why they wanted to become a doctor or a nurse or whoever it is, a social worker, physical therapist. Don't take for granted that, people know, the patients, right, that they know everything you're saying. Stop them, make them slow down, ask if you can record the conversation. If they say no, ask if you can take notes, and make them go slow so you can write it all down. That's their job, and don't be afraid to speak up. I feel a lot of times people get nervous and they get that white coat syndrome, so to speak, and they're intimidated, and they just think whatever they say is the gospel and it's 100% accurate. It's not necessarily accurate. You might know something and think that's not right. Speak up and let them know. Don't be afraid to speak up, because you got to be there for your loved one, because they might not be able to be there for themselves.
Right. Oh, absolutely true. And the other thing to remember about folks in healthcare who, I am not a healthcare worker, but in my experience on the other side, is they have a finite amount of time to spend with you.
Right.
And so they may miss things, or they may be focusing on something you said because they want to solve that problem, but you have questions about other things that are going on. And you may have to be a little bit more forceful to say, I know you're in a rush, but we really need to talk about these things.
Right.
And that's a lot of times easier said than done.
Very much.
Because you feel like the doctor's smarter than you are. Or you know that they're in a hurry and you don't want to be that person who asks a million questions and keeps them late. But they are there to provide you a service.
Right.
And so it's not unlike being in a restaurant. If they come and they bring you your plate and it has the wrong vegetables, or they forgot something or whatever, you ask, and it's fine because they expect that you're going to ask. So getting over that is a really huge thing. And like I said, it's not easy. I had a hard time with it until my daughter was born, and she was a few months old before I really figured out how to speak so that, I was heard.
Yeah, absolutely. In closing, Katie, so you you have this vision of meeting people where they are and sharing what you've learned to save them time and feel supported. One, talk about that statistic you shared with me about the hours of time people spend, but then also what's next for Carefullist and Carefullist the podcast.
Sure. So, yeah, the last time we spoke, this is something that factors heavily into why the Carefullist exists in the first place. And that is because there was a 2011 study, so I'm sure that the hours are more than this by now. But the average caregiver spends at least 13 hours every month on research for their person, looking up information on what the person's situation is, whether it's a disease or an injury or whatever, looking for products and services, looking for medication information, and just research in general. So the goal of the Carefullist, maybe we can't give you all 13 hours back a month, but we certainly aim to give you a good chunk of time back so that you're not looking all over the internet. You can go to one place and find what you need and know that other caregivers have vetted the information and evaluated it and said, yes, this is good. Hopefully eventually can see our logo and know that if we are associated with it, it's something that you should use and will be helpful to you. And in terms of what is next, I really look for the site and the social channels and the podcast to all start working together so that we create this community of caregivers who feel empowered to share their stories. Because I do think, and I think we see this happening, the more people who talk about it in the public forum and the more visible we as a community are, people have to take notice,
Right.
and things have to change. So I really would love for the Carefullist to play a role in that catalyst for broader change in service to caregivers.
That's wonderful. And in closing, where would you like people to go to find Carefullist, the podcast? Do you have a YouTube channel? I know you haven't officially recorded yet. Do you have your YouTube channel and iTunes and all that set up yet?
Well, we have the YouTube channel. So right now it's just Carefullist.
Okay.
Is the YouTube channel. So it will be on YouTube and wherever you find major podcasts. So Spotify, Apple Music, iTunes.
And the podcast, will that be under the Carefullist social media existing, or are you going to make a separate social media?
It's going to be under existing for now.
Okay.
I'm trying to keep myself focused on one project at a time. So if I need to separate it out, I will. For now, it's all just the regular Carefullist channels, which are on LinkedIn, Instagram, and Facebook.
Wonderful. Well, Katie Kristofic, the host of Carefullist, the podcast, and founder of Carefullist, the website. Always a pleasure to see you, Katie. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Have a great day.
You too. Take care.
Thank you for joining us today here at All Home Care Matters. All Home Care Matters is here to help families as they navigate these long-term care issues. We invite you to visit us at allhomecarematters.com, where there's a private, secure, fillable form where you can give us feedback, show ideas, or if you have questions. Every form is read and responded to. And remember, you can listen to the show on any of your favorite podcast streaming platforms, or you can watch the show on our official YouTube channel. Just make sure that you hit that subscribe button so that you never miss an episode. I'd also like to say thank you again to Katie Kristofic, the founder of Carefullist and Carefullist, the podcast. We look forward to seeing you next time here at All Home Care Matters.
Thank you for joining us today. We look forward to you joining us again on another episode of All Home Care Matters. To learn more about the show and to connect with us, visit us at allhomecarematters.com.